Hi, my name is Dr. Peg Abernathy, and I'm talking to you from beautiful Marina Del Rey, California, Southern California, on this beautiful day. And I want to tell you about my NDE experience. My NDE experience happened a long time ago, but I always say that it was, my life really began the night of my NDE. What happened was I was a performer down in Los Angeles, and I had internal bleeding and a massive cyst that had burst. And I was taken to the emergency room, and what was happening, I came from a very staunch Catholic background, and so I was lying on the gurney and I was trying to fight this thought of death that was coming over me. I was lying there, I was praying every prayer I could possibly think of, and I thought, no, I went into this self-survival mode, and I thought, oh, I've got to fight this, I've got to fight this. I was very, very young when it happened. I was in my early 20s. And then again, the thought of death passed through my mind again, and I'm thinking, wait, I'm not dying, am I? I mean, this cannot be happening. I'm young, I'm invincible, I just began my life, right? And then there was another point, and I call it a threshold, where I went, okay, yeah, this is really happening. I think I'm really dying here. And it's very interesting because I went from this mindset of fighting and fighting and fighting to survive to this, it was like I crossed the threshold into acceptance. And once I accepted what was inevitable, and by then, of course, the bells in the hospital emergency room were going off, people started running around. And but I remember smiling, and my smile was my last physical memory of this earth. And I remember a loud roaring sound, a buzzing sound, bells going off, and this kind of a sinking in within to myself. At that point, I was in the most beautiful, peaceful, what I call a subsistence of existence. I wasn't there, I wasn't here, I didn't know anything except this amazing peace. There was no pain. At that moment, I found myself at the top of the hospital room. And I was floating there, and I remember my face was upward, and I also remember consciously thinking, the body is back there. I kept referring to it as the body's down there, it's down there. But I also knew I did not want to look at my body. I didn't want to acknowledge it, and I certainly didn't want to get back in it because it was extremely painful. So at that point, I began to float upwards, and I began floating over what they call negative treetops. I call negative treetops. When you take a photograph and you have a negative, it's got that kind of different look about it, like a negative. I started floating over these treetops, and there were other entities or beings and people, a couple that I recognized, one is my grandmother, waving to me like, hi, come on in. And it was like I was floating above and looking down, and it was so beautiful. Now I have to digress real quickly. Being from a very staunch Catholic background, this is not what I expected. And this whole thing was completely different, although I accepted it once I had transitioned over. I really felt like, yeah, this is it. This is the real thing. This is the real deal. And the reason I bring that up is that I wasn't expecting all of this, but I just allowed it to be, and I kept going. And I had never heard of a near-death experience. There were at the time, it's 20 years ago, at the time there were very few books about it, and people just didn't talk about it. And also the technology in the medical field wasn't as such as we can bring all these people back who have crossed over like they can today, especially with cardiac people. At that point, I just kept floating, and I saw this big tunnel. I had a very atypical experience. Big tunnel with a light at the end of the tunnel. And so I just floated through the tunnel. I entered the tunnel, and I floated toward this light. This amazing, beautiful, peaceful, loving, all-encompassing and unconditional light. You really can't express it in human words because it completely limits the experience, and there are no human words to express it. I say it's more of an emotion than it is a word. And I started to go towards the light, and I describe it as when I burst into the light and I was all encompassed into the light. It's sort of like when you're being born. As an infant, you come out and all of a sudden you're inundated with lights and sound and cold and wet, and you're just inundated. All your senses are just overwhelmed. That's the way I felt, all the way down into the core of who I am, with this amazing love and peace. I wanted this light. I didn't know what it was. I wanted it. I felt it. I needed it. And I kept thinking, oh, I'm home. I'm home. That's all I kept thinking. At that point, I remember looking or having the sensation to move over and look over there, and I started seeing my life pass by, my infancy, my childhood, and I felt good about it. I'm watching myself, oh, I remember that, and all these different things, which now I know they call it a life review. I had never heard of a life review. I didn't know anything about any of this, so this was all new to me. And I started watching myself, my childhood, my early teen years, and then I came to a point where I saw myself being married, which I was about 4 years into my marriage at that time. And I remember seeing my husband as I'm walking down the aisle with my father, and I see my husband there peeking around the people looking at me. And at that moment I stopped and I went, uh-oh, and I knew I had to go back. And I'm like, what? No, but there was this yearning and this something that I knew that I wasn't done with Pete yet, my husband. We weren't finished, and I had to go back. And at that point, I heard a voice say to me, "Not now, my daughter," which I remember thinking at the time, going, who was that? I was thinking, is that God? Is that an angel? Who is that? And also, the relationship that I had with my own personal God at the time wasn't like that. It wasn't formal like, you know, a Hollywood movie, not now, my daughter, but that's kind of the way it felt. It was like a sensation of formality, but anyway, and I knew that I had to go back. And of course, at that, I always tell this joke, and my husband always says, oh yeah, blame it on me that you had to come back. I said, it's all your fault. But in essence, I also believe that, you know, we come back for a reason. And anyway, I knew I had to come back. At that point, I felt myself being whooshed backwards, almost like being sucked backwards, back through the light, back into the tunnel, really, really quickly. This happened very quickly. Back out over the negative treetops, and just floating back as fast as I could go. At that point, then I remember the sensation of being back in my body with a thud, and I remember the sensation of my body being cold and very confining and almost like, you know, bound, like I was bound. At that point, I took a real deep breath, and I guess that's when I was back in the real world. And I remember looking around. I remember blinking my eyes and people looking at me and hanging over me and checking vitals and whatnot. And at that point I thought, okay, I'm back and I'm not done yet. And the last thing I heard from one of the nurses was, I can't believe that kid almost died. And I remember thinking as I closed my eyes, you have no idea what just happened to me. So basically that's it. That's my near-death experience. And I also say that that was the beginning of my life because it completely changed my life.